There are so many things that I don't know and I don't have answers to, but there are some things that I do know and that I know that if a jury knew, that they would have come to a different decision.
On September 14, 2005, the state of Texas strapped a woman to a gurney and ended her life. Her name was Frances Elaine Newton. She was the first black woman executed in Texas since the Civil War, a fact that made headlines across the country. But before the needle, before the courtroom, before the crime scene, there was a girl from Houston's Fifth Ward who just wanted a better life. And somehow, everything went wrong. Things really got darker. But before we get into the details, welcome to the Dark Verdict. If this story already has you asking questions, you are not alone. Make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss a single part of this. Drop a comment below. Do you think Frances Newton was guilty or innocent? Let us know what you think before we get to the end. Frances grew up in one of Houston's toughest neighborhoods. The Fifth Ward was not a place that gave people many options. It was poor, it was rough, and it demanded that you fight just to stay afloat. Her parents, B. Henry and Jewel, were working people. They were not wealthy, but they kept the family together. They gave Frances structure. They gave her love. But the neighborhood had its own kind of pull, and growing up there left marks that were hard to shake. Frances was not a standout student. School was a struggle. She moved through her early years quietly, without much fanfare. Then, at 17 years old, she met Adrian Newton. And everything changed. Adrian had something about him. He was charming, confident, the kind of person who could walk into a room and make people pay attention. For a teenage girl from the Fifth Ward, he felt like possibility, like a way out. They fell fast, and they fell hard. Before long, Frances and Adrian were married. In 1980, their son Alton was born. 5 years later, in 1985, their daughter Farah came into the world. On the surface, it looked like a family. But underneath, the cracks were already forming. Money was always tight. Adrian's charm did not pay the bills. And as the years went on, his choices got darker. What started as marijuana use slowly shifted into something heavier. Cocaine entered the picture, and with it came a different version of Adrian. One that was harder to live with, harder to trust, and harder to protect the children from. Frances was not without her own troubles. In 1985, the same year Farah was born, Frances was placed on probation for forgery. It was a sign that the pressure of their financial situation was pushing her toward bad decisions. She was not a hardened criminal. She was a woman drowning, grabbing at anything she could reach. By 1987, the household was barely holding together. Adrian had run up a drug debt with a man known only as Charlie. The amount owed was $1,150. Not a fortune by most standards, but in their world, it was the kind of debt that came with consequences. And the marriage? It was falling apart from the inside. Adrian had started seeing another woman, Ramona Bell. Frances, for her part, had become involved with a man named Jeffrey Frello. Two people in the same house, living separate lives, connected only by 2 children and a pile of problems neither of them knew how to solve. Then came the insurance policies. 3 weeks before the murders, Frances took out life insurance policies worth $50,000 each. One on Adrian, one on their daughter Farah. She signed Adrian's name on the paperwork herself. He did not know. He did not agree. She forged his signature. Why would a woman insure her husband and child just weeks before they were killed? That question would follow Frances Newton for the rest of her life. Prosecutors would call it proof of a plan. Her supporters would call it a coincidence twisted into a motive. But in that house in Houston, in 1987, something was building. Something that could not be stopped. The powder keg was full. All it needed was a spark. April 7th, 1987, was a Tuesday. On the surface, it looked like an ordinary day. Frances went to work at her insurance job that morning, just like any other day. Back at the house, Adrian was home with their daughter Farah. Nothing unusual. The two of them spent time in the courtyard, relaxed, unhurried. Their son Alton was at school. Frances's brother Sterling was also around, helping out the way family does. But sometime between 6:30 and 7 in the evening, Frances asked Sterling to leave. She said she needed privacy. A private talk, she told him. Sterling left without question. He had no reason to suspect anything. What happened in that window of time is at the center of everything. At 6:45 in the evening, Adrian picked up the phone and called Ramona Bell. He told her he was tired. He said he was going to crash for the night. But then he said something that stood out, something that would later be repeated in court. He told Ramona he would not be able to relax until Frances left the house. He did not trust her. Those were his words. He did not trust her. That was the last known conversation Adrian Newton ever had. Frances, meanwhile, made her way to her cousin Sandre's place around 7 in the evening. At some point during that visit, she had a blue bag with her. Inside that bag was a .25 caliber Raven pistol, a gun that belonged to Jeffrey Frello, passed to her through his cousin. She hid the bag at her parents' abandoned house nearby. At around 8 in the evening, Frances and Sandre drove back to the Newton home together. What they found inside would be described in court documents and news reports for years to come. Adrian Newton was on the couch. He had been shot in the head. He was dead. In the bedrooms, the children told a different and even more disturbing story. Alton and Farah had been shot in the chest. Their bodies were found in their beds with blankets pulled over them, as if someone had tucked them in after shooting them. Alton was just 7 years old. Farah was only 23 months. Frances became hysterical. Sandra called the police. When investigators arrived, they combed through the house looking for signs of a break-in. There were none. No forced entry, no broken windows, no signs that anyone had ransacked the place looking for valuables. Nothing had been stolen. In the world of criminal investigation, that absence speaks loudly. A robbery gone wrong leaves a mess. A stranger attack leaves traces. But this scene was clean in all the wrong ways. 3 people were dead, and the house looked almost undisturbed. Except for the bodies. No forced entry. No robbery. 3 victims shot in 2 separate rooms. To investigators, this did not look like a random act of violence. It looked like someone who knew the house, knew the people inside, and knew exactly what they came to do. The question was, who? And the answer the police landed on would change Frances Newton's life forever. Deputy Ricks was one of the first officers on the scene. He arrived at 8:27 in the evening. What he walked into was not chaos. It was something quieter, and in many ways more disturbing. 3 people were dead. The house was intact, and the woman who had found them was falling apart in front of him. But as investigators began to work the scene, the details started adding up in a way that pointed in one direction. The victims had been shot at close range. There was no sign of a struggle, no furniture overturned, no broken items, no evidence that Adrian or either of the children had tried to fight back or run. Whoever did this moved through that house with purpose. And whoever did this was someone those victims had no reason to fear, at least not until it was too late. The weapon used was a .25 caliber pistol, the same caliber as the gun in Frances's blue bag. When investigators pressed Frances about the gun, she did not deny knowing about it. She admitted she had taken it for the safety of the children, she said. She claimed she had brought it into the home because she was worried. It was an explanation that raised more questions than it answered. Then came the detail that tightened the case around her. Sandre, her own cousin, the person she had spent that evening with, told police that she had watched Frances hide the blue bag. Sandre had seen it, and when police recovered the bag and the gun inside it, forensic testing showed that gunpowder residue on the weapon was fresh. It had been fired recently. Investigators then turned their attention to the timeline. Frances had asked Sterling to leave between 6:30 and 7 in the evening. Adrian's last phone call to Ramona was at 6:45. Frances arrived at Sandre's around 7. They returned together at 8. That left a window, roughly 20 minutes give or take, in which 3 people were shot, the scene was composed, and the shooter was gone. 20 minutes. 3 victims, 2 separate rooms, and not a single sign of panic left behind. The motive, as far as prosecutors were concerned, was already sitting in the paperwork. The life insurance policies, $50,000 each on Adrian and Farah, had been taken out just 3 weeks before the murders. Frances had forged Adrian's signature to make it happen. She had a history of forgery. She had financial pressure. She had a failing marriage. And now, with Adrian and Farah dead, she stood to collect. Frances did point investigators towards someone else. She mentioned Charlie, the man Adrian owed $1,150 to for drug debts. She suggested that Charlie could be responsible, that the murders might have been connected to Adrian's dealings. But police did not pursue that lead with any serious effort. Their focus had already settled on Francis. 2 weeks after the murders, Francis filed insurance claims on both policies. On April 22, 1987, 15 days after the killings, Francis Elaine Newton was arrested. Given that 2 of the 3 victims were children, prosecutors made clear from the start that they were seeking the death penalty. There were details, however, that did not fit as neatly as the prosecution story suggested. Francis had voluntarily told police about the gun. She had not tried to make it disappear. She had not fled. She had cooperated. For someone who had supposedly planned and carried out 3 murders, that behavior struck some observers as unusual. There were no fingerprints recovered from the scene that tied her directly to the killings. And the skirt she had been wearing that night, a piece of clothing that would later become a critical piece of evidence, had been handled in ways that raised serious concerns about contamination. Those concerns would not surface fully until years later, but they were there, buried in the details, waiting. The arrest had been made. The case was being built, and Francis Newton was about to face a system that had already made up its mind. When the state of Texas appointed a lawyer to represent Francis Newton, they gave her Ron Mock. That name meant something in Houston legal circles, and not in a good way. Ron Mock had earned a nickname among those who followed capital cases. They called him Death Row Mock. By the time he was assigned to Francis, he had represented 19 clients in capital murder cases. All 19 had been convicted. 16 of them had been sentenced to death. 19 cases, 19 losses, 16 people sent to death row. That was the man standing between Francis Newton and a lethal injection. What came out later, through appeals, investigations, and the admissions of those involved, painted a picture of a defense that barely existed. Ron Mock did not call key witnesses. He did not file important pretrial motions. He did not challenge the forensic evidence in any meaningful way. He did not bring in experts to question the ballistics that linked the gun to the crime scene. He did not explore the angle of Charlie and Adrian's drug debts, even though Francis had pointed investigators in that direction from the very beginning. On the day of the trial, Mock admitted he had done zero preparation, not minimal preparation. Zero. Francis knew something was wrong. She begged the judge to give her a different lawyer, or at the very least, to delay the trial so that proper preparation could happen. The judge said no. No new lawyer, no continuance. The trial would proceed as scheduled. And so it did, with a defense attorney who had not prepared, representing a woman whose life was on the line. Mock's strategy, if it could be called that, was to put Francis on the witness stand alone. No supporting witnesses, no expert testimony. No challenge to the prosecution's version of events. Just Francis, by herself, trying to convince a jury that she did not kill her husband and children. The prosecution, meanwhile, built their case around the insurance policies, the forged signature, the gun, the gunpowder residue, and the timeline. They painted Francis as a woman who had planned the murders for financial gain, a cold, calculating killer who had shot her own children in their beds and pulled blankets over their bodies. Tom and Virginia Lewis, Adrian's parents, the grandparents of Alton and Farah, were present throughout the proceedings. They had lost their son and 2 grandchildren. Their grief was real and immeasurable. But even they, in the years that followed, would come to express doubts about whether Francis was truly responsible. That detail, the victim's own family questioning the conviction, would become one of the most haunting aspects of this case. On November 17, 1987, the jury returned its verdict. Francis Elaine Newton was found guilty of capital murder on the counts relating to Adrian and Alton. The conviction carried the weight of the death penalty. On October 25, 1988, Francis Newton was formally sentenced to death. She was sent to death row, where she would spend the next 17 years. In the years that followed the trial, the cracks in the case began to show, slowly at first, then more clearly. Ron Mock's co-counsel later admitted that the defense had been incompetent. Not inadequate, not underprepared, incompetent. That admission did not free Francis, but it confirmed what many had suspected from the beginning. Appeals were filed, legal teams came and went, and as the years passed, 2 larger problems began to surface that cast serious doubt on the integrity of the evidence used to convict her. The first was the Houston Police Department's crime laboratory. Investigations into the lab revealed widespread problems, mishandled evidence, unreliable testing, and results that could not be trusted. The lab that had processed evidence in Frances's case was the same lab that was later exposed for these failures. The second problem was the skirt. The skirt Frances had been wearing on the night of the murders had been tested for gunpowder residue and returned a positive result, a key piece of physical evidence tying her to the gun. But questions emerged about how that skirt had been stored and handled. There were serious concerns that the evidence had been contaminated, that the positive result may not have meant what the prosecution said it meant. And then there was the matter of a second gun, a detail that would surface later and complicate the story even further. The conviction stood, the death sentence stood, but the foundation it was built on was beginning to crack. Frances Newton sat on death row, and the clock kept moving. In 1988, Frances Elaine Newton arrived at the Mountain View unit in Gatesville, Texas. She was 23 years old. The cell she walked into would be her world for the next 17 years. Life on death row is not life in any ordinary sense. It is waiting. It is fighting. It is waking up every morning knowing that the state has scheduled an end to your existence, and that the only thing standing between you and that end is a legal system that has already ruled against you once. Frances fought. From inside those walls, she maintained her innocence. She wrote letters. She worked with legal teams. She held on. Her mother, Jewel, did not stop either. On the outside, Jewel campaigned for her daughter. She spoke to anyone who would listen. She kept Frances's name alive in a world that had largely moved on. For a mother, there was no moving on. There was only the fight. Then there were Tom and Virginia Lewis, Adrian's parents. They had buried their son and 2 grandchildren. They had every reason to want the person responsible to face the full weight of the law. But as the years passed, something shifted. Tom and Virginia came out against Frances's execution, despite referring to her by the name Charlie, a detail that carried its own complicated weight. They did not believe that putting Frances to death was the right outcome. A family that had lost everything was now standing up to say that more death was not the answer. In 2004, Frances received a reprieve. It was not a pardon. It was not an exoneration. It was a pause, granted so that further forensic testing could be carried out on the evidence. For a brief moment, it felt like the system was willing to take a second look, but the results of that testing were conflicting. Reports on the gun did not align cleanly. A separate claim emerged from inside the prison system, an incarcerated individual who said they had heard someone else brag about committing the murders. And at least one juror from the original trial came forward to express regret about the verdict. None of it was enough. By 2005, the legal doors were closing. One by one, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals denied a stay. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals denied a stay. The United States Supreme Court declined to intervene. Governor Rick Perry reviewed the case and rejected clemency. Outside the Huntsville unit where executions in Texas are carried out, protesters gathered. They held signs. They called for mercy. They called for justice. They called for someone in power to stop and ask whether the right person was about to die. Inside, Frances Newton waited. The contaminated skirt evidence, the ignored lead on Charlie, the crime lab scandal, Ron Mock's admitted incompetence, the conflicting gun reports, the jailhouse account of another killer, the victim's own family opposing the execution. Piece by piece, the case against Frances had been questioned, challenged, and complicated. But the courts had spoken. The governor had spoken, and on September 14th, 2005, it would all come to an end. September 14th, 2005, the day Frances Elaine Newton had been fighting against for 17 years had arrived. At 6:09 in the evening, Frances was strapped to the gurney inside the Huntsville unit. She did not make a final statement. She did not speak her last words out loud for the record. Instead, she turned her head toward her family members who had gathered to witness the end. She looked at them. She moved her lips, silently, privately, saying whatever it was she needed to say to the people she loved. Whatever those words were, they belonged only to them. She had not requested a last meal. The lethal injection was administered. At 6:09 in the evening, the process began. Frances coughed once. And at 6:17 in the evening, 8 minutes later, she was pronounced dead. Frances Elaine Newton was the third woman executed in Texas since the state resumed executions in 1982. She was also the first black woman executed in Texas since the period following the Civil War. That fact was not lost on those who had followed her case, or on those who stood outside the Huntsville unit that evening holding signs and calling her name. She was 40 years old. What she left behind was not a clean ending. There was no closure, not for her family, not for the victim's family, and not for the people who had spent years arguing that the wrong person had been put to death. Her family, her mother Jewel, those who had stood by her through 17 years of appeals and heartbreak, maintained what they had always maintained. Frances was innocent. She did not do it, and the state of Texas had just executed an innocent woman. On the other side, cousins of the victims wanted something Frances never gave: an apology, an admission, some acknowledgement of what had happened to Adrian, to Alton, and to little Farah. That acknowledgement never came, and so that wound remained open. The questions that surrounded the case did not die with Frances. They lingered. Was Frances the person known as Charlie, the name Adrian's own parents had used when referring to her? Or was Charlie someone else entirely, the drug dealer Adrian owed money to, the lead that police never seriously followed? Did Ron Mock's complete failure to prepare a defense cost an innocent woman her life, or did it simply fail to save a guilty one? Did the Houston crime lab's contaminated evidence and unreliable testing send Frances to death row on proof that should never have been admitted? And if that evidence was compromised, what was the conviction actually built on? These are not small questions. They are the kind of questions that sit at the heart of what the death penalty means and what it costs when the system gets it wrong. Frances Newton's case did not change the law. It did not stop executions in Texas. But it added another name to a growing list of cases where doubt, bad lawyering, flawed evidence, and a rushed process combined to produce an outcome that could never be undone. 8 minutes, and it was over. Forever. What do you take from that? Was she a killer who never showed remorse, or a woman who had already said everything she needed to say? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Do not forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell, because the next story we are covering is just as heavy, just as complicated, and just as important. We will see you there.